In this episode, we're going to focus on the uncomfortable moment when a dashboard or settings page says encryption is enabled, yet you still cannot honestly answer a simple question. Is the data actually protected in the places and paths that matter? Cloud platforms make it easy to feel safe because encryption is often on by default, and the user interface language can sound final and authoritative. The problem is that sensitive data is rarely a single file sitting in one location, and encryption is rarely a single toggle that covers every copy, every movement, and every access path. Validation is the discipline of turning a comforting label into a proven outcome, which means you can point to evidence that coverage exists where you expect it to exist. When you learn to validate encryption coverage, you stop arguing about settings and start reasoning about reality, which is exactly what audits, incident response, and good engineering decisions require. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Encryption coverage is the concept that encryption is not just present somewhere, but consistently applied across the full set of storage locations, services, and lifecycle artifacts where the data actually lives. Beginners often assume that if a database is encrypted, then the dataset is safe, but modern systems create snapshots, replicas, caches, logs, analytics extracts, and backups that can each become a separate copy of the same sensitive information. Coverage also includes the idea that encryption should apply across environments, because test and development systems frequently end up holding production-like data in practice, even when they are not supposed to. Another part of coverage is key control, because encryption that uses keys with overly broad access can still allow inappropriate decryption through normal permissions. The reason this matters in cloud security is that attackers and accidents both tend to exploit the weakest copy, not the best protected copy. Validation means you identify all the relevant copies and paths, then confirm encryption and key boundaries apply in a way that actually reduces risk. A strong validation mindset starts with scoping what you are trying to validate, because encryption coverage can mean different things depending on the data, the service, and the organization's obligations. You need to be clear about which data is sensitive, where it is expected to exist, and which services are allowed to process it, because you cannot validate everything everywhere with equal effort. You also need a baseline statement of what protection should look like, such as all sensitive data at rest must be encrypted with keys that have controlled usage permissions, and sensitive data in motion must be protected by secure transport. This baseline helps you avoid a common beginner trap, which is checking whatever is easy to check rather than checking what matters most. Scope also includes a time dimension, because coverage must remain true over time, not only on the day you checked. When scope and baseline are clear, validation becomes a repeatable measurement instead of a one-time reassurance. The next step is mapping the data lifecycle in simple terms, because encryption coverage gaps almost always appear when data moves or multiplies. Sensitive data is created or ingested, stored, processed, and then often copied for reporting, machine learning, troubleshooting, or backup. Each phase can introduce a new storage location, and each location can have different defaults and different access rules. A common real-world failure is that the primary data store is encrypted, but a nightly export lands in a general-purpose storage area with weaker protection, and nobody notices because the export was meant to be temporary. Another failure is that backups are encrypted differently, retained longer, and accessible by a broader set of identities, turning backups into the easiest target. Validation means you deliberately ask where data might exist besides the obvious place, including secondary copies created by automation and operational processes. When you map lifecycle honestly, you discover where coverage must be verified, not merely assumed. After you know where data could exist, you can validate encryption at rest as a set of coverage questions rather than as a single setting. The first coverage question is whether every storage location that can contain the sensitive data has encryption applied, including primary stores, replicas, and long-term archives. The next question is whether encryption is consistent across regions and accounts or projects, because organizations often spread workloads across multiple administrative boundaries. Another question is whether encryption applies to both new and existing resources, because environments often contain older systems created before secure defaults were adopted. This is where drift becomes dangerous, because a policy might protect new resources while leaving older ones unprotected indefinitely. A deeper coverage question is whether encryption is applied in the mode you expect, because a service may encrypt certain layers while leaving some components or certain data types outside the protected boundary. Validation turns these questions into evidence by checking settings and confirming they align with your baseline rather than relying on a single enabled indicator. Key usage boundaries are the next critical part of validation, because encryption can exist and still fail as a barrier if too many identities can decrypt. A key management system, KMS, is often used to manage encryption keys, but the existence of a KMS does not automatically mean key usage is disciplined. Coverage validation, therefore, includes checking whether sensitive datasets use the intended keys and whether key policies restrict decrypt operations to narrowly scoped identities. It also includes checking separation between key administration and key usage, because if the same broad admin groups can manage keys and use them, a compromised admin account can become an instant decryption path. Another coverage question is whether keys are segmented by environment and data domain, so that a compromise in a lower trust zone does not grant decryption power in production. The reason this is tied to cloud security is that identity compromise is a common attack path, and encryption is only meaningful when keys are not trivially accessible through routine permissions. Validation makes key boundaries part of what enabled means. Validating data in transit is also part of making encryption coverage real, because data protection is weakened when sensitive content can be observed or altered while moving between systems. Cloud services often communicate across networks in ways that are invisible to end users, so it is easy to assume transport protection exists everywhere. The practical reality is that secure transport can be inconsistently enforced, especially when services integrate with legacy systems, partner systems, or internal components that were not designed with the same assumptions. Validation here is about ensuring that sensitive paths require protected connections and that insecure fallback paths are not quietly available. Coverage also includes internal service-to-service communication, because internal does not automatically mean safe, especially in cloud networks where boundaries are shared and dynamic. The reason this matters is that attackers often look for low-friction interception points, and misconfigurations that allow plaintext movement can create those points even when storage is encrypted. When you validate transit protection as part of encryption coverage, you reduce the chance that enabled at rest becomes meaningless in practice. Another place coverage fails quietly is through application-level behavior, where services return decrypted data through normal access paths even though the data is encrypted at rest. This is not a flaw in encryption, but it is a reminder that encryption at rest protects against certain threats while access control protects against others. Validation, therefore, includes confirming that only intended identities can retrieve sensitive data in decrypted form, and that authorization rules align with data sensitivity. Identity and access management, IAM, becomes central here because it determines who can read data, export data, replicate data, or change sharing settings. A common coverage gap appears when a role meant for operational troubleshooting includes broad read access to sensitive datasets because it was convenient, and that role ends up assigned widely. Another gap appears when service identities used by automation have broader access than necessary, making stolen automation credentials an indirect decryption pathway. Validating coverage means checking whether the set of identities that can obtain plaintext is truly limited, not simply whether encryption exists underneath. Encryption coverage must also include the operational artifacts that are easy to forget, because the forgotten copies are often the least protected. Logs can contain sensitive values, especially when systems log full request payloads, error messages, or debugging details. Temporary storage and caches can hold plaintext versions of data for performance reasons, and those caches may be governed differently than primary stores. Analytics datasets are another common issue, because teams often copy production data into analysis environments to speed up insight, and those environments may have weaker controls. Validation means you treat these artifacts as part of the sensitive data surface area, not as incidental noise. It also means you validate whether the organization has a disciplined approach to reducing sensitive data appearing in logs and temporary places, because preventing unnecessary plaintext reduces what encryption must protect later. The reason this connects to cloud security is that attackers frequently search for secrets and sensitive values in logs and secondary systems, and a single exposed log store can undermine the best encryption on the primary database. Coverage means the ecosystem is protected, not just the centerpiece. A strong validation approach also checks how encryption behaves during change, because migrations and deployments are high-risk moments for coverage gaps. When data is moved to a new service, there may be a staging area where data exists in two places, and one place can be configured less securely because it is considered temporary. Temporary often becomes permanent when deadlines hit, and that is how silent gaps survive. When new services are adopted, teams may assume encryption defaults are identical to older services, but small differences in how keys are managed or how artifacts are created can create coverage holes. Validation during change means you do not wait for the next audit cycle to discover gaps. You build checks that confirm encryption coverage before a change is treated as complete. This mindset is not about slowing down delivery, but about preventing the familiar pattern of shipping first and discovering later that sensitive data ended up outside the protected boundary. In cloud environments where change is constant, coverage validation has to be integrated into how change is accepted, or it will always lag behind reality. Evidence is the backbone of making enabled mean provably protecting the data, because proof is what survives scrutiny when memories fade and dashboards change. Evidence includes records that show encryption settings and key assignments for relevant resources, and it includes records that show key usage boundaries and who can perform decrypt operations. It also includes operational records that demonstrate the control remains in place over time, not just at one moment, because drift can reintroduce gaps quietly. Evidence should be traceable, meaning you can connect it to specific resources and timestamps, and it should be retained long enough to support investigations and audits. Another important aspect is evidence integrity, because if evidence can be modified by the same identities that might misuse keys or data access, then it is less trustworthy. The point is not to create paperwork, but to ensure that when you claim coverage, you can back it up with specific, repeatable facts. In cloud security, the ability to prove matters almost as much as the ability to configure, because proof drives trust and decision-making. Coverage validation also benefits from thinking in terms of exceptions, because exceptions are where policies become stories instead of controls. Many environments legitimately need special cases, such as legacy integrations or temporary testing needs, but unmanaged exceptions are a classic way encryption gets weakened without anyone noticing. A disciplined approach treats exceptions as explicit decisions with documented scope, limited duration, and compensating controls, rather than as informal shortcuts. Validation then includes confirming that exceptions have not expanded beyond their intended boundaries, and that the compensating controls are still in place. This is important because exceptions tend to accumulate, and accumulation turns rare deviations into a new normal that undermines baseline coverage. When enabled is used as a comfort label, exceptions hide behind it, because the overall system still looks encrypted. When enabled is treated as a provable claim, exceptions have to be visible and explainable, which discourages casual weakening of protection. Another valuable part of validation is checking for the gap between configuration and outcome, because some systems can be configured correctly while still failing to protect data in the way you expect. For example, a resource may be marked encrypted, but key permissions might allow broad decrypt access, which means the encryption barrier is weaker than the label implies. A storage system may encrypt objects, but if access permissions allow public reads, the encryption does not prevent exposure through the normal read path. A service may encrypt data at rest, but the application may export data in plaintext to a less protected location as part of a routine workflow. These are outcome gaps, where the control exists but the security outcome is still unsafe. Validation is about catching outcome gaps by reasoning about how data can actually be obtained and what barriers exist along that path. This is why a strong coverage mindset combines configuration checks with access path thinking, because the attacker does not care which flags are set, only what can be accessed. When you validate outcomes, enabled becomes meaningful. Ongoing validation requires regular cadence and trend awareness, because encryption coverage is not a one-time achievement. New resources appear, teams change workflows, services evolve, and permissions drift, so coverage must be rechecked in a way that highlights both current gaps and emerging risk. Trend awareness matters because a small number of gaps appearing steadily can indicate a systemic process problem, such as insecure templates or inconsistent provisioning paths. When you track coverage over time, you can show whether controls are stabilizing or whether drift is increasing, and that becomes a management tool, not just a technical report. This also supports incident response, because knowing the usual coverage patterns helps you interpret whether a newly discovered gap is new or long-standing. A mature program treats coverage validation as a routine health check that produces evidence and drives improvements, rather than as a stressful event before an audit. The more routine it becomes, the less likely it is that encryption gaps will survive unnoticed. As you develop this skill, it helps to keep a few beginner misunderstandings in mind, because they are exactly what leads people to trust the enabled label too easily. One misunderstanding is assuming encryption at rest automatically protects against unauthorized access through normal service permissions, when in reality authorization determines who sees plaintext. Another misunderstanding is assuming default encryption means every copy is covered, when in reality exports, backups, logs, and analytics datasets can escape the protected zone. A third misunderstanding is assuming keys are safe because they live in AKMS, when in reality key usage permissions determine who can decrypt and how broadly. Beginners also often assume that once something is configured, it stays configured, and they underestimate drift and exceptions, especially in fast-moving environments. The antidote to these misunderstandings is validation, because validation replaces assumptions with evidence and replaces labels with outcomes. When you can articulate these misunderstandings and how validation addresses them, you demonstrate the kind of reasoning cloud security expects. By the end of this episode, the central idea should feel grounded and actionable at the conceptual level. Encryption coverage is only meaningful when you can prove it applies to the data where it actually lives and to the access paths that actually matter. You start by scoping sensitive data and defining a baseline for what protection should look like. Then you map the data lifecycle so you know where copies and movements create risk. You validate encryption at rest across primary and secondary stores. Validate key usage boundaries through KMS policy and IAM roles, and validate transit protection so sensitive paths are not quietly downgraded. You extend coverage thinking to operational artifacts like backups and logs, and you pay special attention during change because change is where silent gaps are born. You build evidence that is traceable and retained over time, and you manage exceptions so they remain rare and accountable. When you treat enabled as a provable claim instead of a comforting word, encryption becomes a control you can trust, defend, and maintain in the real cloud environments you will face.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.